All right, let's go ahead and get going. So welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Nest Speaker Series. And this session is entitled Protecting Kids in an Era of Online Exploitations and AI Risks with Natalie Shoup. My name is Allison Blair. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the programs manager for Nest. And whether you're new to Nest or you've worked with us before or been to one of our sessions before, we're so glad to have you here with us today. Just to give you a little bit of background about Nest, the organization was established in 2004, and it was created out of the documentary film Playground, which was directed by Nest's executive director, Libby Spears, and produced by George Clooney and Abigail Disney. Since then, we have provided comprehensive violence prevention education in various school settings across the United States. Our programs empower children with the skills needed to prevent exploitation and abuse, to resolve conflict peacefully, to bolster mental wellness, to encourage healthy relationship behaviors, and to foster resilience. Our evidence-based curricula address root causes of violence and harm and provide the tools necessary to break harmful cycles. We also offer tailored workshops, educator trainings, and victim assistance resources to create safer and more inclusive communities where all young people can thrive. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. Live transcription has been turned on for this session, so you can access the subtitles or the full transcript in the menu bar below. If you have any issues, you can reach out to us. I'm not sure if the chat is open. If the chat isn't open, you can reach out to us in the Q&A box as well, and we can help troubleshoot anything. We will have a Q&A session after the presentation, so please feel free to drop any of your questions into the Q&A box. Some of you also submitted questions during your registration process. We're going to do our best. There were a lot of really incredible questions that were submitted. I'm sure you all will submit some in the Q&A box later. We're going to do our very, very best to get to most of those questions. If we don't answer your question, we are going to be sending out additional resources after the webinar. So rest assured, we're going to try to answer all of your questions and concerns as best as possible. This session is being recorded, and it will be sent out to all registrants next week, along with any of those resources that we've discussed or that are discussed in the presentation today. So let's get started. We're so privileged to have Natalie with us today. Natalie is the industry and data lead for Safe Online at UNICEF, where she leads initiatives that prevent and respond to online violence against children. With a portfolio of over 100 projects globally, she fosters impactful collaborations with governments, tech companies, civil society, and academia to drive meaningful change in the fight against online abuse. With experience in the US, Brazil, and Colombia, Natalie has supported victims of trafficking, armed conflict, and gang violence while advocating for greater agency for children and youth. She's worked for over a decade applying cutting-edge data science to solve pressing social justice problems. We're so glad to have her here with us today. So please join me in welcoming Natalie.
Thank you so much, Ali. I am excited to be here with you all. I would love to hopefully be able to answer a lot of questions throughout the session. So I do encourage y'all to drop questions into the Q&A as we go. But we do have a lot that I think we would like to cover today. So this is a pretty broad intersection in terms of looking at children's safety and digital environments. So looking at protecting kids in a digital era, this can cover a lot of things. There's a lot that's involved and we could engage with here, but I am going to set some expectations in terms of how we're going to dig into some of the evolving challenges of online safety for children and safety for children in a digital era. So thinking especially about some of the most extreme forms of harm. So there's definitely a lot of different ways that we can talk about this issue. There's a lot of concerns about children's well-being and mental health. Now with the intersection of digital technology, there's a lot of concern about digital technology and how it is impacting different groups of children and also some of the emerging trends and how those are expressing in terms of children's experiences and trends of harm. So we're really going to focus especially on the latter and digging into some of the more severe forms of harm, but certainly touching hopefully on a lot of those topics. So just we can dive into sort of what we will cover today. On the next slide, we have a little bit of a run of show just to give you a sense of what we'll be going through. We're going to start with some definitions just to set the stage. We will dive further into all of those topics throughout the session. So it is just to kind of do a level setting with definitions. Then the scale of the harm, speak very briefly to some of the scale of some of the most severe forms of harm. Then looking at some myths and misconceptions that we tend to have around this topic and reversing some of those and giving some more detailed statistics and information about children's experiences. And then looking at some resources that we would like to share with you, and then trends, three particular trends that we're seeing lately that I think would be particularly relevant to dive into as examples of the intersections of digital technology and children's experiences of harm online, and then some solutions, hopefully to have some takeaways that you can action a little bit more concretely. So if we go to the next slide, we'll kick off. We are thinking today we're talking about some sensitive topics. We are speaking about sexual violence, self-harm, suicide. This is an activation warning. Really want you to take care of yourself. If you need to take a step away, get a drink of water, listen to what's happening in your body as you're listening to all of this today. Some of it can be fairly sensitive and heavy, and so we want to make sure you're taking care of yourself. The next slide starts us off with the definitions. So to set the stage a little bit, what we're talking about here on the next slide is the scope of internet or communication technology and the intersections with children's safety. So any situation involving digital internet and communication technologies at some point during the continuum of abuse or harm or exploitation. This means that we can be talking about experiences that occur fully online or through a mix of online and in-person interaction between offenders and children. A lot of experiences of children today are both online and offline. There really is no separating the two. And so emphasizing these interlinkages, not only between in-person and digital environments, but also between different forms of harm is really important because there are a lot of linkages as well and overlap between the different forms of harm that children are experiencing. So whether that's cyberbullying and online harassment, or the production or spreading of child sexual abuse material, or actual physical harm through sexual exploitation and abuse, there's overlaps between all of these, and we will see in some of the scenarios that we dive into a little bit later how some of those are connected. Then to set the stage with some of our next definitions, if we look first at cyberbullying and online harassment, this is bullying that can be conducted on digital devices. Some instances may cross the line into unlawful or criminal behavior. So often we think of this maybe as a less severe form of harm, but certainly there are very real and severe impacts of cyberbullying. Their online harassment can be defined as the use of information and communication technologies to cause harm to another person. This can involve threats, embarrassment, humiliation in digital settings. So of course, you'll see and probably understand already that a lot of forms of harm online replicate and sort of amplify some of the harms that children are experiencing offline as well. If we go to the next, we think about online enticement and coercion. This is often called grooming now. So you're probably familiar with this term. It's a process by which a predator establishes a connection with a minor, offering support, attention, trying to gain trust. So they slowly gather personal information, they desensitize them to sexual or violent content, and they exploit any vulnerabilities the child may have. Often, predators pretend to be minors themselves to manipulate children into providing nude or partially nude images or videos in the case of sexual exploitation and abuse, and use the material to coerce children into more severe forms of harm. With the advancement and dominance of digital technologies, we're seeing now that bad actors have unprecedented access to children online. And so some of these forms of online harms are escalating quite quickly. So we'll get into that when we talk about scale. The next definition is to talk a little bit about sexual exploitation and abuse. So as I mentioned, we're going to focus on some of the more severe forms of harm online and intersecting with digital technology. offline cannot be separated from online, as we mentioned up front. So images of abuse happening to a child are abuse. Online child sexual exploitation and abuse is a crime that targets children and teens, including victimizing a minor for sexual gratification or some other personal or financial gain. Notably here, I think one conception is that all sexual exploitation and abuse is driven by sexual interest. It's not necessarily, and in particularly with technology now and online environments, there's other drivers of this form of harm, principally financial. Financial and humiliation also tend to feature as drivers of some of these forms of abuse. This takes many forms. It occurs all over the world, and it's really rising in scale, which again, we'll get to shortly. But to dig first into a couple of the specific forms of this, next we have the definition of child sexual abuse material. CSAM is the acronym for that. This replaces the term child pornography. That is a term that still exists in some of our legal documents in the US, especially, but we really try not to use the term child pornography as it implies consent. And so thinking about this issue as it is material capturing the sexual abuse of a child. So naming it more explicitly and accurately is important. Terminology is evolving and it's not always perfect. So child sexual abuse materials, any visual depiction of sexually explicit conduct involving a minor, less than 18 years old in the US. There are forms of that. Self-generated content is sexually explicit images or videos produced by a child or teen themselves. This term is potentially misleading. It's not fully perfect in terms of how people find agreement about speaking about this term in the community, but it's hard to find terminology sometimes. And so we can't let perfect kind of stop us from digging into some of the experiences that children are having when it comes to generating material of themselves that are sexually explicit. So this is the term that is commonly used now. Then another form of child sexual abuse material that we're going to dig into a little bit further is generative AI CSAM, so production through digital media of CSAM and other wholly or partly artificial or digitally created sexualized images of children. So this means it can be fully an artificial image, a synthetic image, so it can be completely made up of a child, or it can be based on a real child or a real image of a child in a depth altered through generative AI means. This can include not only images, but also text, video, audio generation. And then we have another form of child sexual exploitation and abuse that is becoming increasingly common, which is live streaming. This occurs when an offender compels a child victim to engage in sexually explicit contact during a broadcast in real time to one or more viewers. The quality and ubiquity of cameras on mobile phones makes it easier than ever to create CSAM whenever there's access to a child. So we're really seeing, again, increases in some of these forms of harm. And lastly, a very specific form of exploitation and abuse that we're seeing a rise in, particularly in the US at this moment, is sextortion, so sexually coerced extortion. There's traditional sextortion, which is when an online predator threatens or blackmails a victim to provide sexually explicit content and threatens to share this content with others. And then there's financial sextortion when a predator demands money in exchange for keeping the victim's sexual content private. This again gets back to some of the financial drivers of this harm. I want to just pause. I don't think I see any questions in the Q&A, but if there's any questions just about sort of level setting some of the definitions of some of the forms of harm that we will dig into, please do drop them there and we can come back. But we will get into some more specific examples about some of these different forms of harm that children are experiencing. So first, to just give a sense of the scale of the harm, we see that this is unfortunately an increasingly organized and worsened problem by the speed, scale, and scope of digital technology. So digital technology is really exacerbating the problem of child sexual abuse, child abuse, harms to children online. So 1 in 6 children before the age of 18 experience abuse online. Increased technology use among children and teens has also collaborated in creating space for these crimes to flourish. And some of the main features that we're seeing and things that we'd like to dig into and have people be aware of is that children are being exposed to harms and pressures younger than we think. Online interactions have different boundaries than in person, and shame is one of the biggest obstacles to kids seeking help. So we can see here some of the numbers in terms of how this form of harm has increased. If we look again at one of the most severe forms of harm, online child sexual exploitation and abuse has increased exponentially. We can see if we go next to the number of reports, it was 1 million reports in 2014, 21 in 2020, and now 36 million reports submitted to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is the global clearinghouse for these reports, based here in the US. They received 36 million reports of child sexual abuse material online this 1 year ago in 2023, and that is increasing. There's no way to accurately account for the breadth of what is not reported, or additionally what can be found on harder to access digital environments like the dark web. So the lack of understanding of online CSEA and increased technology use among children and teens creates space, again, for these crimes to really increase. And often communities are left on their own when it comes to understand online dangers that exist and how to prevent them. And so we're hoping through discussing in a little bit more detail the way children are experiencing some of these harms and what we're seeing in terms of trends today, even as they continue to evolve, as technology evolves, as children's use of technology evolves, hopefully digging into some of these examples will help you navigate better when you encounter some of these experiences with young people in your lives. If we look next, this is just a little bit of a brief teaser of how a few stories of child sexual exploitation and abuse and what that looks like. This is a resource we'll share that so that you can watch it with slower time if you would like to hear more stories from young people themselves who are victims of this form of harm. But we'll just give you a little bit of a sense so that we have a little bit more of a story to put to some of the numbers that we just shared.
Imagine the most private, vulnerable moment of your life, and then imagine there being a photo of that.
When you're a child, you're malleable, and I think he really meticulously took his time.
It's all behind a screen. To find other people talking about you like that, it's pretty scary.
He posted my body on Instagram. I cannot even face people in school.
So this echoes some of the same numbers that we were just sharing. The different stories share different ways that young people or children have experienced this kind of harm. And we'll dig again a little bit more into that. Next, when we go to a few of the myths and misconceptions about how children experience harm in digital environments and how technologies are intersecting with children's safety. So the first myth and misconception we want to dig into is about stranger danger. So this is a common stereotype that strangers are the main perpetrators of online child sexual exploitation and abuse or other forms of harms that are similar for children. In fact, these acts are more often committed by people that children know. Friends and others known to the child are the most common type of perpetrator, especially of online CSCA. More than 1 in 4 minors reports having an online sexual interaction with another minor online, and the same amount report online sexual interactions with adults. This is also important to note as we'll speak a little bit more about peer-to-peer violence and how there has been an increase in young people as perpetrators of harm to other young people. And that is a really important experience for us to consider when we're working with young people. Next, when we dig into another misconception that it's just pictures, often when you think about digital environments, it seems distant or perhaps less severe. Often people can be somewhat dismissive that this is maybe not as important of a priority just because it is less familiar, especially to adults now working with children in this space. But actually, it is really important to correct this idea and return back to the idea that online and offline cannot be separated. They're very interlinked. And it's very, very common for young people to have experiences of harm and abuse online and in digital spaces. So 1 in 3 minors reported having an online sexual interaction in recent studies, and 10 to 12% of material of child sexual abuse is infants and toddlers. This is an important statistic to bring out because I think if we're thinking often people can point to perhaps this is teenagers exploring relationships, exploring sexuality, engaging in sort of the blurry edge cases around age. However, we see from the actual material evidence of these forms of abuse that it's actually taking place at very, very young ages. And we're seeing actually an increase of abuse at young ages, whether that's some of the more extreme forms of abuse, like sexual exploitation, or if it is other forms of enticement and grooming and sexual activity and interaction. We also see that more than 50% of suspects in CSAM-related crimes commit hands-on offenses against children in their communities. So this is really important to reverse some of the myths that perhaps online is less severe or not as real in some senses, because there's often either physical abuse that is captured in images and then reshared for re-victimization or viewing. And then there is also a correlation between people who commit offenses online and then go to seek out children and commit physical hands-on offenses in person. So those are some really important things to note in some of the trends that we're seeing with children's experiences of harm online, to really emphasize how interlinked online and offline harm are and that you cannot separate those out. This is a very severe problem that is affecting many, many children because, again, of the access, the unprecedented access that bad actors can have to children in digital spaces that cannot scale as much in offline spaces. If we go to the next myth and misconception, we think about here that I often get the question, where does this happen most commonly in the world? And does it not happen as often in the US? It does happen in the US. It does happen everywhere in the world. As some of the previous statistics showed, there's been global studies, there's been studies based just in the US with children around their experiences, and also looking at evidence from law enforcement to better understand some of the trends of children's experiences of harm. We do see that it is happening everywhere in the world. Online spaces sort of level the playing field a little bit for children's experiences around the globe. So we do see similar experiences for many children in different countries. There's studies that have taken place just in the US with very diverse populations, representative populations in the US, to really understand how it can affect different children differently. And those studies very much align with a lot of the trends that we see in other parts of the world. Of course, there are differences in some of the expressions and manifestations of harm. But if we dig into some of the experiences of children in the US specifically, we see that from some recent studies, 1 in 7 minors in the US have shared their own self-generated child sexual abuse material. So nudes is what it's often called. It is a fairly common experience for children. If we dig into that number as well, it's actually most commonly 11 to 13-year-old girls that are featured in those images that are reported. So this is something that's happening at quite young ages, and it's quite normalized with young people. When we're thinking about education and conversations that we want to have to shift norms and to raise awareness with young people about risks, it's really important to meet children where they're at and understand what is sort of the norm of their experience now, whether that's through peer pressure, whether that's through exploration, and not necessarily to continue that normalization, but rather to be able to meet them where they're at and have conversations about the risks that can be entailed and start to shift some of the normalization of sharing those images. 1 in 5 teens in the US who regularly log onto the internet have received an unwanted sexual solicitation. This is really important to note because it just shows how much children are experiencing this on a more regular basis and how widespread it really is. This this form of contact is really, really common for children in online spaces. And then over 6,000 investigations by the Department of Homeland Security have helped to find and prosecute perpetrators of online CSCA just in 2023. Those were global investigations, but including investigations in the US. And then finally, just thinking about the perpetration side of things and how common it is, the US is the country hosting the most domains for child sexual abuse. So 15% of child sexual abuse domains are hosted on US sites. Then if we go to the last myth and misconception that we'll touch on is that children will disclose when they recognize that they've experienced abuse. Often people say, if it was traumatic, if it was abuse, you would know, you would be afraid, you would disclose, and you would disclose right away. This is not the case for many reasons. Some of those reasons is that children do not recognize when they're experiencing specific forms of online harm. They think it's normal. That's just the way it is online. That should not be the case. We need to have conversations with children so they know that this should not just be the way that they experience the online world. The online world should be a much safer place for them, and these things should not be normal. The conduct and the contact and the content that they're exposed to. And so that's a really important conversation when we get to solutions that needs to be had. There's also 20% of 9 to 17-year-olds who encountered harmful sexual interactions chose to keep it to themselves. 1 in 5 victims of sexual solicitation tell a parent, meaning 4 out of 5 did not. And we can get to some of the reasons for that. That can be, again, because they don't see it as a big deal. They prefer to block rather than report. For various reasons. But one of the main reasons in blockers for disclosing to a trusted adult or parent is victim blaming and shame. There's a lot of stigma around this. As I said, if we're not meeting children where they're at about what's normal in terms of experiences, there can be a lot of victim blame for the minor who shared images, not the person who leaked those images without their consent or who exploited them based on those images. And actually, we see 1/3 of minors and one half of caregivers tending to blame the minor themselves. This is a really important thing to note about how children are experiencing this harm right now, because it is one of the biggest barriers to children seeking help and reporting when they experience this kind of abuse. Shame and fear of punishment are major barriers. When we look at a recent study again in the US, 1 in 4 children felt embarrassed and worried about being judged. 1 in 5 worried about getting in trouble with their family. Similarly, 1 in 5 worried about getting in trouble with the police. It's not very clear to young people what the laws are around this, and if they share their own content, if that will be criminalized. So it's really important that we clarify that for children, not only to help them understand the risks, but also for them to feel that they can seek help. And then 1 in 6 felt that they were to blame for the situation. It's really, really important that we start to shift these norms from blaming victims for their choices, however risky they are, and put more focus on how non-consensual sharing or manipulation or coercion to share images is a violent act, and we have the power to intervene and be supportive to change cultural norms. If we go now to some resources that speak to this, I know we're moving quite quickly, but it's because we want to dive in a little bit more to some of the examples of trends, and because there's a lot to cover here just so that we can get to time for some questions. Again, I'll pause just in case there's any questions that people would like to drop in here, but just to reflect on some of what was shared in terms of myths and misconceptions. We're really trying to get an understanding of how children are experiencing harm. It's important that we talk to them. It's important that we meet them where they're at without stigma and shame. And we see that if we are able to open up some of those conversations and learn from them how they're experiencing some of these different harms online, whether it is from peers, whether it's from people they know offline who they're interacting with online, or whether it's from people who they've just met online and only have an online relationship with, we can see that there's various ways that children are experiencing harm, whether it's in a digital environment, like a game, like a social media platform, or whether that is something that's exacerbating harm that's happening offline. So again, if it's capturing physical abuse, if it's amplifying bullying that's happening offline and then it continues online, it's really important to understand again those interlinkages. So I hope that some of those myths and misconceptions can start to give a real idea of how children are experiencing some harm, especially some of the most severe forms, as well as really underline the importance of acknowledging how connected online and offline is for young people and children, and how important it is that we start to reverse some of the stigma and shame that comes with some of these experiences. You can dig in a little bit further to that in some of these resources. The first one here is an initiative from the Department of Homeland Security, Know to Protect, that was recently launched. They have a lot of good statistics and information and resources for educators, for parents, for law enforcement. Thorn is where a lot of the research on children's experiences that inform some of these statistics came from. They do really excellent work with young people to really source some of their experiences online. And so it's really great to dig into some of their resources. They also have a recently launched parent center where they have tools for parents that are really, really useful. Safe Online is the organization I work with. There's resources there. We focus globally, but there is a lot of information that is also relevant to the US. NCMEC, so National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, has their cyber tip line data. That's where a lot of the information on the latest trends comes from, because they are the global clearinghouse for these types of reports. So when it comes to children's online experiences of harm, they really do have a lot of information, but also a lot of resources based on that information. So they have education resources, and they also have actual resources to help intervene in some of these experiences of harm, which will come later. Then there's Common Sense Media. They have a ton of good articles. I saw a lot of questions in the Q&A ahead of time before the session about differential experiences of children, thinking about equity when we're thinking about interventions, talking about pornography with kids and the effects of pornography on children, talking about AI intimacy, generative AI, and how to talk to your kids about that, different safety features on platforms, and how parents can accompany their kids, or how educators can make children aware of the different risks on different platforms. They have guides across different platforms, across different age groups, and across some of these different emerging technology trends. So it's a really good place to get some of those resources. And then lastly, the Family Online Safety Institute has some really good digital parenting guide, but they also have a lot of resources for community organizations, for schools, etc., to kind of dig in to child online safety. So those are the resources I wanted to call out to, and hopefully, we can share, I think, around after the webinar, but there's not time to dig into all of the valuable information that these organizations hold, but they are a really good place to start if you're looking for some of that further evidence, further information, and further guidance. Then if we move to trends, which is one of the big pieces we wanted to hone in on. And again, we don't have nearly enough time to go into this as much as we would like, but I think there will be some examples where we can highlight some of the latest trends at the intersection of technology and how kids are experiencing technology, and harm, and how children are experiencing harm right now. So children's experiences of self-generated material and sextortion. Here we see that 1 in 4 minors agree it's normal for people their age to share nudes. So we kind of spoke to that already. Again, meeting kids where they're at, and understanding that children are seeing this as a normal activity. However, there are some trends showing that kids are more aware of some of the consequences. I think this has come from a recent, very intentional push by educators, by National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, by law enforcement to put out PSAs about some of the risks to sharing self-generated material. There was a spike in sextortion, where we see that more than 1 in 17 minors reported having personally experienced sextortion. That's a very, very high number. In recent years, that has been principally with young boys, with teen boys, for financial motivations. And so they were being financially sextorted. And that was often leading to very quick escalation to self-harm or even suicide. That spurred law enforcement and different organizations working with young people to do a big advocacy campaign in the US to raise awareness about this issue. And we've actually seen that boys are now actually this year sharing less self-generated material than they were in previous years. We also see that roughly 1 in 8 minors know a friend who has received money or gifts in exchange for self-generated child sexual abuse material. This is a trend in monetizing child sexual abuse material. And so there's some concerns with people that work with advocating for young people's safety, especially safety online, with this trend. While the majority of minors reported their friends had not experienced this, 1 in 8 reported they had a friend who received money or gifts. So that also could deal a little bit with underreporting, as children might not be as open to sharing if they had thought about or engaged in this type of activity themselves. So it's also important when we think about some of these trends to see that there is definitely underreporting when it comes to asking young people about their experiences. But we do see, despite the fact that there has been some major PSAs and some shifts in the dynamics of children experiencing sextortion, we do see that financial sextortion continues to be a major and ongoing threat, with an average of 812 reports of sextortion per week to NCMEC, so to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. Perpetrators are often actually criminal gangs that are just engaged in various scams, and financial sextortion is one version of this new scam. So again, this speaks to the fact that not all abuse and sexual abuse of children online is necessarily sexually motivated. This is actually a form of harm that children are experiencing that's financially motivated. But what we're seeing is there's certain trends in this form of harm where the tactics that are used, the language that is used, and the platforms that are used are common. And so if we do awareness raising with young people for them to understand that this is not just them, that other people are experiencing this, and that there are ways to address the problem if they seek help, it really has a huge impact on these experiences of harm escalating to self-harm or suicide or more severe forms of abuse. So if we look at the next slide, it actually gives an example of some of the ways that we're seeing the trends in language. This is a really good example of collaboration between young people, between law enforcement, between educators, parents involved in different cases related to financial sextortion. Very quickly, we were able to get trends on the language that's used. And this is information that NCMEC has put out in some of their PSAs, so that people can know how to identify when they're being targeted as part of one of these scams. And then hopefully, if young people have that awareness, they can recognize sooner when they're going to be a victim and hopefully prevent that. Or if they cannot, and they do get into a situation of sextortion, they're able to seek help and understand that some of these threats are not actually what will happen, in terms of threats of being accused of being a pedophile, threats of their family not loving them, threats of being arrested. That is often the pressure that is put on children in these situations. And there's a big sense of urgency that, again, can lead to really severe outcomes of harm. And so having an awareness of how this looks, so that we can have open conversations with young people before this happens. Again, being aware that this happens quite often, more than 1 in 17 minors having personally experienced sextortion, and thinking about how 1 in 6 discuss thoughts of suicide or self-harm as a result of that experience. So it is really important that we are looking at this as a trend and a problem overall, recognizing what is common to that experience, sharing it back to parents, to children, to educators, so that we're having those conversations and understanding how to seek help and how to respond in that situation. One way to respond in that situation is not to respond, to immediately cut off contact, to not share images, to not share money, and to report it to NCMEC and to law enforcement. And there's a tool online that NCMEC has to take nudes and take child sexual abuse material down of yourself. So there is a way to report that material and get it taken down off the internet, which is one of the biggest fears of young people, is that once it's out there, their life is ruined. But there are ways to address that as well. So it is important to be having these conversations when we're thinking about these particular trends of harm. If we go to the next slide, we get a quick look. There's a teaser because NCMEC has put out an interactive experience for adults to be able to understand, or children even to understand, how this looks in a pretty realistic way. And that helps in terms of modeling the language that they might see and how they can potentially leave these situations. So we'll just show the teaser really quickly, but you can go deeper into this interactive experience yourself or with children.
Okay.
Apologies, didn't take myself off mute. So that kind of speaks a little bit to a very common experience that young people are having, in particular in the US. Self-generated material, the ways that that can be manipulated, and the ways that children are facing some similar trends just based on the use of technology in a specific way for financial motivations. That is sort of something that we've seen over the past couple of years, and again, with some really intentional efforts has reversed. But if we look now at this second trend, which is intersections with emerging technology, so generative AI specifically, is really top of mind for a lot of people. A lot of people are worried about generative AI, or curious about it, exploring it, trying to understand it, and maybe even seeing already some experiences that are troubling. AI presents and has presented tremendous potential to tackle actually the issue of child sexual abuse and exploitation online. It's helped for many years. There's been tools that have been developed using AI, machine learning, generative AI for victim identification, for identifying perpetrators, for being able to triage some of the massive volumes of information that law enforcement or content moderators face. It's been used in very positive ways, but recently, with the sort of opening of generative AI technologies to the public more and more, with these models that have now been open, it has created a lot of new ways to sexually exploit and re-victimize children. So the generative AI tools have enabled the misuse of children's benign imagery or even existing abuse imagery. It reduces barriers to sexualizing minors. So in the case of sextortion, for example, it takes down the first step of even needing to manipulate or groom a child into sharing a sexualized image. Perpetrators can skip ahead to the step of just threatening that they have a child sexual abuse material of that child using generative AI models. There is also this potential misconception that it's not real child sexual abuse material because it's generated material, it's synthetic material. It is harmful, it is illegal in the US. The images that don't depict a real child or an actual child do put a strain on law enforcement resources because they're overwhelmed already with data and images, and then having a huge influx of images because of generative AI is highly problematic for actually being able to dedicate the right resources to find real child victims. And when children are put into deepfakes, it's very devastating. It's equally traumatic. And or similarly traumatic. And it is incredibly important that we start to address some of the ways that we're seeing new technologies being leveraged for harm against children. So we're seeing that it's starting to increase again pretty rapidly. In 2023, NCMEC received 4,700 reports of CSAM or other sexually exploitative content related to generative AI. They're increasingly severe and photorealistic. And the repercussions of that are that this can not only create new material, but it can also increase some of the associated harms of a child being victimized with child sexual abuse material and coerced into other forms of abuse, or of perpetrators who are viewing this material, and then that correlation to physical in-person contact abuse. So there's a lot of associations. There's a lot that's not understood yet, but there is a lot of trends that law enforcement and people who work with child protection are seeing already. And one of those very concerning trends is that 1 in 10 youth ages 9 to 17 have reported that their peers have created deep fake nudes of other peers. So this sort of speaks to also the peer perpetration of violence and how it's normalizing certain ideas around harm. So if young people are creating deep fake nudes of their peers for cyberbullying or because they think it's funny or to themselves commit harm, very intentionally, that is really increasing and facilitating more problematic behaviors of young people. We're seeing those intersections in different ways with young people. So not only perpetrating abuse themselves or violence in the form of bullying or creating child sexual abuse material themselves by creating deep fake nudes of their peers. But we also see that very day-to-day uses of generative AI now in kids' lives are affecting their mental health, their well-being, and outcomes related to sort of self-esteem, self-harm, etc. More severe forms like suicidal ideation. So with girls, for example, in particular, we've seen the use of filters on social media apps or different apps really having a very specific impact on self-image, and that relating to mental health outcomes. We're also seeing, for example, actually boys are quite at risk for some of the more problematic use of AI intimacy apps. So things like character AI. There was a recent case where a young boy committed suicide because he had formed a relationship with his character AI character and had been encouraged in some ways to commit suicide and had followed through on that. And so some of those questions around the ethical use of generative AI applications, but then also just the very, very big gap in understanding how that intersects with children's experiences, in particular their mental health and well-being, and how that can lead to other forms of harm, is a really big concern at the moment for a lot of people. We can see a quick example of a way that people are starting to address that. If we actually skip one more ahead, sorry. Here, and some of those impacts on young people of generative AI day-to-day technologies. we can see from this example actually a pressure that has been put not only by different campaigns like this, but led by other child protection actors and from parents and young people themselves. And actually now some social media companies have recently announced that they will not be allowing teens to access filters because of the concerns on mental health and well-being. So there is impact from people listening to young people and working with them to kind of get this message out around what they're experiencing in terms of harm. And that does make a difference on how these technologies are designed and put out for young people to use. So then if we go lastly quickly, because we're getting to the end and I want to make sure we have time for at least a couple of questions. The last experience, which is very related to the previous two, again, because many forms of harm are very intersecting, is some emerging trends in peer-to-peer violence. So I've alluded to this already a few times, but there are some really concerning things we're seeing about peer-to-peer violence and noting, calling out some of those trends. We see that very many teens experience bullying. 21% experience bullying on online platforms in a week from one study. Victims of cyberbullying are more than twice as likely to engage in self-harm than their peers who have not been victims of cyberbullying. Again, that shows how intersecting some of these forms of harms are and how it is a risk factor when a child experiences cyberbullying or harassment or grooming, and then that can result in being a risk factor for much more severe manifestations of harm. Currently, there's many phone apps that are easily accessible to generate AI images of nudes or with child sexual abuse material, what it is. That's very problematic, and there is a lot of blurry legal questions around that at the moment. But what's really important is that in the absence of more systemic solutions to this, it's really, really important that at a community level with educators, with parents, and with young people, that conversations are being had about how those types of behaviors can be risky, can be violent, and can be problematic. And we see this in extremes with some recent rises of violent online groups targeting and coercing 8 to 17-year-olds in particular into very egregious acts. So if we go to the next slide, you can kind of see actually a very important parallel that needs to be drawn when we're talking about preventing harm and addressing how children are experiencing digital technologies and being in digital spaces. There's some violent online groups recently who have been deliberately targeting minor victims on open messaging and social media platforms to extort them into recording or live streaming acts of self-harm, producing child sexual abuse material, into sexually explicit acts or even suicide. There's a very common approach to targeting young men, in particular young boys, so young boys, teen boys, into violence, to perpetrating violence against their peers, and then also the similar types of grooming for victimization of sexual exploitation. So many of the same things that we've spoken about that relate to how people are coercing or manipulating or grooming young people into sexual abuse and exploitation can be very similar for how young boys in particular are experiencing being targeted to perpetrate violence. Often in these groups, one of the most notable groups recently that had many, many victims, it was started by a 16-year-old boy in the US on Discord communities. It was moved to various different platforms, but it was very, very, very severe and concerning forms of harm that he was committing and then recruiting others to commit, other peers, other young people to commit against their peers. It included how-to guides on sexually exploiting and extorting minors. And that was something that really is driven by the same forms of targeting people who are vulnerable, people who don't feel like they have community, people who are at other risk, and being able to coerce or manipulate them into committing harm, and then keeping those cycles of violence where once a young person has committed harm, they feel like it's really hard to then leave that community. And so then they end up being someone who, if they were experiencing harm, then committed against other people. So it's a very difficult cycle to break. And we're seeing an increase in those forms of violence. So it's really important to be looking out for signs, not only of victimization of exploitation and abuse and forms of harm like cyberbullying, but also the perpetration of those same things by young people. We really need, again, to shift some of the norms and talk about vulnerability and community in a very different way that is not based in violence. So if we go now to some solutions, I do want to leave it with a few of the resources here. There is, I think, to speak to some of the questions that I've seen pop up as well. It is pretty, in terms of the DHS has statistics on how much have resulted in successful prosecutions, how many of those investigations result in successful prosecutions. There's more information about user-generated content and the recent social media announcements about some of the different restrictions and features that they're putting out for child safety and teen safety in response to some of the advocacy that's been done, not only by community organizations, civil society organizations, but also very much by parents and educators and children themselves. You'll see a tool for testing out your knowledge on generative AI imagery, and if you can detect that or not. It guides you through some of the information about some of that critical thinking and some of the technology development. There's also Take It Down is the website where you can have, if you have child sexual abuse material of a young person that you would like to take down or they would like to take down, they can report it there and have it taken down. There's a few prevention education resources and the interactive portal to kind of understand how sextortion happens. And also the last two are resources for help seeking for problematic sexual behaviors. So for young people who are exhibiting problematic behaviors in terms of perpetrating violence, it's really important to break the stigma around that as well and make sure that those young people are getting help also without too much shaming and rather with a help seeking approach to really shifting those behaviors as early as possible. In the last couple minutes, I'm just going to touch on these last few points in terms of solutions that we can see at a systems, at a community, and an individual level. There's a lot of information to touch on in terms of how children are experiencing harm, how technology, which is so quickly evolving, is intersecting and creating different, not only wonderful opportunities and experiences for young people to connect and to learn and to develop their imagination, but also some very concerning situations of harm. And so we really need to just be able to have open conversations about how that looks from a child's perspective. And I hope that some of this information in terms of what some of the recent trends are, what we need to be paying attention to, and what is a common experience for young people now, so that we can start to dig into ways to address that. At a systems level, that definitely looks like tech design, safety by design. Tech industry really needs to think about young people's experiences and their safety first. That is not something that's necessarily happening now in the design of technologies. And so it's really, really important that we continue to advocate for that so that we see those changes being made. Regulation is really important to have aligned standards and laws that really account for survivor experiences and children's experiences. Investment in this. So anything you can do to support putting more resources into this at a local community, bigger picture level is really important because it's an incredibly under-resourced area. Because it is new, because it involves technology, it is not something that has a lot of resources against it, and it's a fairly new space. And so it's important that we continue to put resources into preventing and addressing these forms of harm. And then lastly, at a systems level, having more evidence. We had a lot of statistics here and a lot of information about the trends, but it really is just scratching the surface. And there's some really significant gaps and underreporting around some of these issues. And so having more specific research and data can really inform better safety measures and support to victims and survivors. If we look at a community level, What we see here is that on the next slide, community level, we see here that training to different community actors is really important in facilitating connections between law enforcement, between schools, between community-based organizations and parents. It's really important that those connections are being made and that capacity is being given so everyone is sort of speaking about the same issue, kind of on the same page about this, and strengthening community ties around the sensitive issues. Breaking stigma and shame really requires that people are having similar narratives about this topic and know how to kind of speak to each other and speak to children with sort of one voice. Creating a targeted educational resources for parents and guardians is also really important. So educational resources, not only for specific age groups of children, but also for parents and caregivers is really important. Spotting signs and how to respond, that should be accessible. One of the biggest barriers to reporting is children not knowing where to go. And so being able to share those resources, which some of them were shared in the presentation today. And then practicing upstander and bystander behavior, being active about interrupting harm, such as victim blaming, and advocating for prevention education and awareness raising. And lastly, as we come to time at an individual level, it's really important that we talk about this, that we keep communication open and judgment-free about digital experiences with children. Coming into conversations with curiosity and without shaming is so crucial, and it has an incredible impact. We have seen lots of success from that type of approach, and so it really is so important to be able to have these conversations with children. Spending time offline and ensuring balance, that there's, not all or nothing. It's not all online or all offline, but just having a mix of both. And modeling that balance for kids in your life, and then developing healthy relationship skills, going further upstream, thinking about prevention, thinking about showing kids what is healthy and what is not healthy, will help them navigate any risky situation, no matter how technology changes and no matter how bad actors continue to find different ways to exploit technology. Kids will be better equipped to deal with any of those situations if they have a fundamental understanding about what is healthy and what is not. And then again, knowing where to go for help. So seeking help when it's needed, not worrying about the shame and stigma, but intervening as early as possible, looking out for signs of behavior change, isolation, self-harm. That goes for victimization as well as perpetration of violence. And if a situation escalates, seeking help from online or professional resources is really important. I will end there because I know we've gone over time, but I just want to say thank you so much for joining, and hopefully we can share a little bit more in the follow-up to this to answer any questions you might have.
Yes, thank you so much, Natalie. I know that we're at time. I'm going to just check the Q&A box really quickly. We can see if there are any questions that maybe we didn't cover. Oh, this is a good question. Do you know what the age limit is that companies are using to restrict the filters for children and youth, Natalie?
Sorry, I'm on mute. I think it depends on the social media company. I think recently Instagram released an announcement about that. And so I think it just depends on the company itself. But that is very available if you're able to search, and we can share that as a resource as well as those announcements come out. But I'm not sure exactly what the Instagram age limit was recently, but it's definitely something that's been recently in the news as they're trying to update their safety centers and their resources for kids.
Okay. And I guess one more question, and then I know that we're at time and we want to wrap up, but this, someone asked, what percentage of cases end in successful prosecution? So what's the sort of general outcome a lot of the time of prosecutions of CSAM material?
Yeah, so in speaking to that, I mean, it's tricky. It depends on, again, which case. It is a lower percentage. It's not that high. That is because, so I think from the data that I showed, it was over 6,000 investigations by DHS in 2023. I think that about a third of those move to indictments to prosecute. And I think that's because there's a lot of barriers to the types of evidence, to criminal justice education. So judges and criminal justice staff understanding this issue as well. There's a lot of barriers with education there, as well as the evidence and hold in how different tech platforms hold evidence, how different law enforcement across different jurisdictions hold evidence. And so it does result in lower rates of prosecution generally in this field.
Okay. Thank you so much, Natalie. So I know we were a little over time. I appreciate all of you for hanging in there with us and being here with us tonight. I want to thank Natalie so much for sharing your expertise and the incredible work that you're doing, and taking time to talk more to us and share these resources with us too. And like we said before the session started, and like Natalie reiterated, we will be sending out more all of the resources that she put together for you today, and we'll put together some more resources for you to be available as well. We send the follow-up, and that'll go out within the next couple of days. I want to let you all know that if you wanted to reach out to us at Nest Foundation about anything, you can. I'm going to drop in the chat a link to our contact page on our website so that you can reach out for any questions that you might have about this session or about the programming that we provide in general. You can schedule a call, you can ask for more resources, you can do all sorts of things in that contact form. I'm also going to ask, if you don't mind taking a few moments, I'm going to drop in a link to a post-session survey if you have about 5 minutes, just to let us know your thoughts and your feedback and what else might best serve you and your community and your needs and the young people that you work with. We would greatly appreciate it. Again, Natalie, I want to thank you so much for being with us, and thank you so much for your time and your expertise. And we want to thank you all for coming and being with us this evening, and we look forward to seeing you in future sessions. So thank you so much.
Thank you.